Hi, I'm Ken. I started out this week planning to do an episode about Queen Elizabeth Machen stamps. I realized, though, as I was starting to do that episode, that my catalog only goes up to the year 2000, and I know that there were a lot more Machen stamps put out between the year 2000 and the passing of the Queen in the year 2022. So that series is going to have to wait till I update those album pages, which I hope to do soon because I love that series very much. Instead, today we're going to take a look at the stamps honoring King Edward VIII. It's a much smaller set, and it should be a pretty small video in comparison to some of the ones I've done in the past. Before we do that, though, I need to mention some sad news in the stamp community. Fellow YouTuber, stamp collector Bob Hole passed away this week. Bob ran the longtime YouTube channel Bob Collects Stamps. That YouTube channel was one of the first YouTube channels to cover stamp collecting, and Bob's presence in the community will be sorely missed. I'm sorry to see and sorry to share about his passing. This is my only page of British Edward VIII stamps. I have just these 4, both mint and used. Every time I look at this page, I laugh, though. These 4 stamps are the only 4 that King Edward VIII ever got. Just these 4. The Prince of Wales, Edrew Albert, Christian George, Andrew Patrick David. Wow, that's a mouthful. Usually royals only get 4 names. Anyway, Edward became king in 1936, after his father, George V, died. The stamp on the left is George V, Edward's father. In my World War I album video, I talked about how the printing process and design choices for stamps radically changed over this period. This is a great example of that change. Edward was king from January 20th, 1936 until December 10th, 1936. That is, he was king for less than a year. I could dive into more history about him. Much of it is unflattering, but this is a stamp channel, not a history channel. What's important to know is that when he became king, Edward was in a relationship with Wallis Simpson. Edward loved her and was eager to marry her, but at the time she was not considered a suitable match for the king and not someone who would be accepted as a future queen. Wallis was an American, and she was getting divorced from her second husband. While today these don't seem like such big issues, they mattered a lot to people back then. It also seems to me that as the king, Edward could do whatever he wanted. But other factors were at play, both political and religious, and he was not permitted to marry her. He was faced with the choice to either stay married, marry and deal with all the chaos that would cause, or give up the throne. Edward chose to abdicate, making his younger brother, Albert Frederick Arthur George, commonly known as Bertie, the king. Bertie would become King George VI. That's him on the right. After Edward abdicated, he became the Duke of Windsor. There's more to his story, still more unflattering details that I'll leave for others to cover. We'll stick to the stamps. Edward was king just long enough for these 4 stamps to be issued. Other stamps were in the process of being designed and approved, but none of them would be officially released. Indeed, Canada, Australia, and the Falkland Islands were all in the process of issuing stamps before Edward abdicated, and none of those were officially released either. So poor King Edward would be remembered for just these 4 stamps. You can pick up the whole set mint for just a few dollars. There are also varieties of these stamps, proofs, watermark orientations, and the like that will cost a bit more, but those are for the specialist collector. This stamp also came in booklet panes, including ones like this one with advertising messages in the selvage. These are not particularly rare or expensive either. Edward would go on to marry Wallis Simpson. The 2 of them would remain together until his death in 1972, so at least that endured for the 2 of them. I'd say that a good long marriage is better than having more stamps in your honor. But there's more to Edward's postal history than just these 4 stamps. These stamps were issued for use in the British Post Office in Morocco, what was then known as the Morocco agencies. There were overprints for this post office starting all the way back with Victoria, the Queen on the penny black, and up through 1957 on Queen Elizabeth issues. There are 4 basic types of these stamps. The first row is denominated in French centimes. The second row is denominated in Spanish centimos. The third is denominated in English pence. Finally, that 4th row has stamps overprinted just Tangier, also denominated in English. They were for use specifically in the Tangier area of Morocco. So far I have just these 3 Morocco agency stamps, but I'm happy with them all having all 3 denomination types. These stamps have other minor variants having to do with the size of the overprints, but that's getting a little too specialized for this video. If you get a lot of these, then do some research into these differences. If you're counting along with these additional 11 types on top of the 4 base stamps, King Edward VIII is up to 15 stamps. I mentioned before that Canada, Australia, and the Falklands were in the middle of producing stamps for King Edward before he abdicated. None of those were officially released, but this block of 6 was sent to someone as a favor before they were recalled. This block never got returned. Sometime later, one stamp was separated from this block and came onto the market. You'll never get one of these. That single sold in 2017 for over $123,000 US. But let's be generous and add it to our running count. That's 16 stamps. An interesting note, even though Canada was preparing stamps for Edward with his abdication and the scrapping of that issue, Canada didn't issue any stamps at all in 1936. Just because Canada didn't issue any stamps of King Edward VIII, they did issue some stamps of Edward when he was the Prince of Wales. Canada had a number of stamps featuring the royal children. The top row are 2 regular postage stamps, and the bottom row are 2 revenue stamps. Again, let's be generous and add all 4 of these to our running total, 20 stamps. And let's not forget Newfoundland. They were even better at including the royal children on stamps. All 5 of these are regular Newfoundland postage stamps, including one of my all-time favorites, the first stamp showing Edward as a curly-haired baby. That brings our count to 25 stamps. In 2006, Edward VIII would reappear on this souvenir sheet. This sheet honors the 70th anniversary of the Year of 3 Kings, that's 1936. The only stamp that's valid as postage on this sheet is the single 3-pound Queen Elizabeth Machen stamp. Unfortunately, that means our total Edward stamp count stays at just 25 stamps. Finally, in 2012, Edward would again be featured on a British postage stamp. That's him in the middle of this series of 20th century monarchs. I think it's interesting to note that all the first 4 stamps include a silhouette of Queen Elizabeth. That's a rule for all British stamps, that they feature the reigning monarch. But notice that the last stamp doesn't include the silhouette of the Queen. That's not needed, even for consistency, because she's pictured on the stamp already. And with this series, our count goes up to 26 stamps. And this is the last one so far. In 2019, this sheet of stamp classics came out. The first stamp on the second row is a reprint of an earlier King Edward stamp. Well, not exactly. The 1.5-cent stamp is on a 1 pound 55 stamp, again including the silhouette of Queen Elizabeth. I really can't say why her silhouette is on that last stamp that also features her. Well, that's it. With that sheet, that brings our total to 27. 24 if you take out the Australian stamp that shouldn't have been released and those 2 Canadian revenue stamps. I think if we stick with 24, then that's a collection size that almost any collector, almost any average collector could get a hold of and have a complete selection of King Edward VIII stamps. So I think that's a good goal for a lot of people. Put together a collection of King Edward VIII stamps for yourself.